Hey everyone, you're in good traffic. Thank you so much for coming back this week for another episode of the show, kind of a workshop on walkability and walkable urban design here in the United States. I'm joined today by one of the legends, undoubtedly, someone who I have known about for years, ever since I got into the urban planning, urban design world, someone I've looked up to greatly, but for some reason had never put the puzzle piece together that he's also from the greatest state in the United States, Ohio. I'm joined today by Dan Burden. Dan, thank you so much, first of all, for taking the time and being in good traffic with us.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. It's an honor, and I'm excited to be part of your podcast.
Hey, thank you. Well, I got to start off. I saw some videos of you in a Waymo last night. So as someone who's been in this world for as long as you have, doing the amazing work in all the states that you've worked in, what was it like to experience something like that?
To be in a Waymo?
Yes.
Well, it was like entering another world. It really was, to be sitting in a vehicle where you could watch the steering wheel go by itself. I would pay attention to what the posted speed limits are, the exact speed being matched by Waymo, and then watch cars passing us on both sides because so many people drive over the limit.
Oh, yeah, it's just the norm, right? But it is crazy how, it's a safe, we talk about this all the time. It's the safest driver we feel like we've ever been with, which says a lot, I think, about the standards that we have for our drivers in this country. But I'm glad you got to experience that.
Oh my gosh, it was such a treat.
For those that don't know, and not Arizona, California, Waymo is a self-driving Uber, rideshare, Lyft. And it's a very cool experience. One thing I'm always surprised about is people say they got used to it really fast and it felt crazy, but then they go, oh yeah, it kind of, this is something I could get behind, and I don't know.
And you think about technology, it's like, had this been discussed 20 years ago, everyone would have thought you were a Looney Tune, right? And but today it's a very ordinary thing.
Yeah, and we were just talking about that with rideshare in general this weekend. Of if someone would have told me in middle school, or my parents more so, hey, you're going to ride in strangers' cars soon, they would have been like, no, we'll never do that. That's unsafe. That's scary. But it's really crazy how fast, the norm changes. And I think that's a good sentiment in general. Just as we talk about cities, it's like a lot of things feel impossible until they're just norms. And then we're like, we can't imagine a world without it. So.
Well, exactly. Yeah, the previous 5 days I was in Los Angeles and now here for 4 days so far, never in a car that I drove, right? Mm-hmm. And just using transit and my feet and Lyft. Yeah. And the combination is it's just so natural and so right not to have to go and rent a car and deal with the atrocities of being stuck in traffic, trying to figure it out on your own.
Right. Absolutely. And it's one of those things that I think speaks again to this optimistic attitude that I'm continuing to try to return to. Because in this work, better than anybody, it's easy to get pessimistic, right? There's constant reminders of how hard things are, of how built and baked the environment is, of how, this even on a optimistic timeline, something might take a decade. And that's a scary thing. Yeah. But these sorts of sentiments, I think, are important to celebrate. So I'm glad that you enjoyed that experience, and it was a interesting one for you, to say the least.
It really is. The world's changing faster than most people believe.
Certainly.
And it certainly is in the transportation world. And the people are coming back to the senses in one way. You've got several pendulums, and hopefully you'll never hit one another. but the walkability is going way up, and it's going to go up even faster.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about kind of how you first got into this whole world, because this is such an I find when I tell people outside of people who don't live at cul-de-sac, right, about when we really get into the minutia of this whole conversation, they're like, that's so interesting. How do you get involved in that? I can only imagine what that conversation was like when you started getting involved. And I think that I've heard you talk before about your origins really being in biking, and that being a place where you started. I'm first of all very curious, growing up on the west side of Columbus, I know how it is now. I would love to know, how the heck did you first get into being so avid about biking growing up in the Hilltop area in the west side of Columbus, Ohio?
Well, I might have been born with those genes. When I was, I believe, when I could first ride a bike, my dad would shove us, and walk behind, and we'd get very good at it very quick. But we only had one bicycle for 3 of us kids. And I talked my sister into having the bike on her day, doing the dishes for her, or on her day of doing the dishes. And so I ended up with a bike 2 out of 3 days, which I thought was pretty cool. And so the bike was always magical. I remember getting my first serious bike, a JC Higgins, for Christmas one year. And it was a 3-speed. And I just loved that bike. And about the time I was in 10th grade, maybe 11th grade, I would go off on weekends into the countryside, read a book or whatever, but just feel like that was what my whole life should be about, is bicycling. And it was about 10th grade that I dreamed up the idea to one day bicycle around the world, which wasn't very often done back then. In fact, when I started riding a bike, there were probably no more than 12 adults in all of Columbus that rode a bike. And we all kind of knew one another, but we're from all over the city. It's a big city. And but it was that minuscule, right? The number of adults that would ride a bike. It was toward the middle of the 60s, maybe more toward the end of the 60s, that more and more and more adults just started to buy a bike. Didn't necessarily ride it. It was just, like a hula hoop. You had to have one, right? Even if you didn't know how to perform with a hula hoop. Same thing with bicycles. And but as I graduated from high school, I started leading bicycle trips in the American youth hostels. And first they'd just be local trips, but then I led trips for groups of 20 or so to expeditions. And when we go through a town, people were just surprised. These guys are coming to our town on bicycles, right? And people were so kind and so friendly, but it was very unusual to have groups of bicyclists at that time. And then eventually we got into promoting bicycle events. Being from Columbus, you know this, Tazrav, tour of the Scioto River Valley. 2-day bike ride, 210 miles in the 2 days. And that grew and it grew and it grew. Eventually it topped out at over 10,000 riders every year. But I was part of the group that originated those rides. They first started in San Diego, Dr. Clifford Graves. And he formed the International Bicycling Society, and he'd lead groups over to Europe. But that's how small it was back in the beginning. And then I went in the Navy, and in the Navy, I bought an old junky bicycle, and I'd ride it everywhere. I never owned a car until I was 35. And only because my daughter then, it were just so many errands we had to run that it became practical. But I didn't own a car until 35. And it was just a great life back then. And what I quickly envisioned is that more people should be enjoying the freedom of the bike and the places you could go, the things you could see, whether it was during the daylight hours or even at night. I'd be way out in the countryside and come home at night after the valley fogs had settled in and you slip down. You enter another world. When you're on a bicycle and there's no traffic and you're off in a rural area like that. So it just kept growing and growing. And after a while, the high school dream I had, which was one day to bike around the world, transformed to something practical. I couldn't imagine learning all the languages to go around the world, but I could imagine I could learn one additional language, Spanish. So bicycle from Alaska to Argentina.
That's right.
And my wife and I and another couple did that. And other people would join us along the route. But it was pretty remarkable journey.
Yeah, I mean, not many people can say they've done that. First of all, just that alone, let alone when we get into everything else that you've accomplished and been front seat for in the U.S. in terms of all these conversations. But I'm curious, at what point did that? So what fascinates me, first of all, is that so many kids love biking around, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like that, I think that's a pretty universal experience when you get your first bike and when your parents let you go around the block for the first time. And then you find out you can go to the ice cream shop or to school and you're like, wow, the world starts to get more small, but also manageable. And you start to see things differently. At least this was my experience. And I know a lot of friends share that. I think we always kind of look at biking in this country largely as leisure. Maybe if we're lucky, exercise. We get to that point where we see it as this exercise experience. Those are kind of the first two stages of cultural bike adoption, we could call them, I guess. But then that third stage of transportation, right? That's an entirely different thing. That involves network. That involves, destination rather than closed loop circuits, all these things. What point did your childhood love, which evolved into an adulthood love for just biking around, turn into you looking at cities and urban design and seeing this as, oh, this isn't just a thing I like to do, but this is something that is vital to the network of how we move people around places?
I would say that it evolved, that at first I was interested in bicycle as recreation, as discovery, as meeting people, as expanding the world that you take in, right?
Sure.
And so I never thought of it as bicycle commuting at all. And then I had gotten so well known for the recreational side. My wife and I launched an organization to develop the TransAmerica Bicycle Trail, the longest recreation trail in the world. Yeah. And after that wonderful event, populated by about 4,500 Americans during the bicentennial, going across the country both ways. Yeah. We became pretty well known. And the TransAmerica Trail and the organization that formed it, the Bicentennial, got written up in just about any significant magazine at the time. Even Playboy magazine covered us, Sports Illustrated, Parade magazine, Reader's Digest. It was just, you pick up a paper. We were popularizing bicycling.
Yeah.
And that was actually my goal, was to get more people to enjoy the fruits of being on two wheels and spinning off. And so I had never thought of it in terms of bicycle commuting. And then one day I got a call from somebody I had met at a bicycle show, a developer of bicycle products, Wayless Industries. Lester Todd was his name. And Lester said, Dan, I've got the perfect job for you. Now, Lester and I had only met for maybe an hour, but he was impressed by the things I had been doing. And I said, well, great, Lester, I'm just about ready to graduate. And where is the job? And he said, Florida. Wow. And I said, no, I've already done my stint in Florida. I had been in the Navy in Florida for a while. And I said, Lester, I'm not interested in Florida. He says, no, Dan, this is the perfect job for you. And the funny thing is Lester had already gone into the Florida Department of Transportation and convinced them that he had the perfect candidate, which is strange because over 300 people applied for the job, the state bicycle coordinator at the time. And then I said, well, I'll come down just to see what the job is. I flew in and found out it was the perfect job for me. Wow. Right? It was like this perfect match. I know I'm making this story longer than it should be, but it's a fun one. It turns out that what Florida had done, I was sharing offices in Washington, D.C. with the Bicycle Manufacturers Association. And they were giving me the office space to run the Bicycle Federation of America, an organization I started. And then one day, the staff for the Bicycle Manufacturers Association came in and said, Dan, you speak bicycling, don't you? I said, yeah. He said, there's this guy we don't know what to do with. He wants to have lunch with us and talk about something going on in Florida. And I said, well, I'd love to have lunch with this guy. And I did. And He wanted to have people ride bicycles from inn to inn to inn in order to save the old inns of Florida. All the old hotels spread out throughout the state from the early years. And his name was Herb Hiller. And I said to Herb at the end of our luncheon, I said, Herb, if you're going to have bicycling work, it's got to be more than recreation. I'd already figured that out. Go back and see if you can find people who are interested in making it a serious way of getting around. He went back. I had forgotten about Herb, and I think a couple years had gone by. And then when I was reading the literature, after accepting the job, I was on the plane coming back, pouring through the literature that they gave me, and I come across this name, Herb Hiller. He had gone back. He had found the right ears and created the right impetus for Florida to be, I think it was at the time, the 4th state to have a bicycle coordinator.
Okay.
But one of the very first.
Yeah.
And so I loved the job. I had never worked in governance, and I really didn't know the states. I was learning the counties. I was learning the cities. I was learning how government worked all at one time. But I was given free rein, totally free rein to do what I wanted, which is unheard of in state government.
Sure.
You're under this level and this level and this level, and you don't do anything without permission. Well, I had full permission to do everything because the department resisted that they were to have the job. And they resisted it twice. The first time they just said, no, we're not interested. And the governor's staff wrote back to them, no, this is something you need to take seriously. So then they wrote a very weak proposal about how they would position the job. And they called the top 4 people in the Florida DOT into the offices of the governor and said, you should all be polishing your resumes because you're out of here if you don't take this seriously. So that made my job pretty easy because they knew their jobs were at risk if they didn't give me full license to go out and be creative. And so the first year or so, I was just like a kid in a candy store, right? Yeah. And one of the first things I asked, I said, I want to go off and see the best states, what they're doing. And I put together a little package. I went to Oregon, Washington, and California, studied the best that was going on in the country at the time, and then came back. And maybe 10 days after I got back, I got a request to lead a bicycle expedition through China.
Wow.
So they gave me another 30 days of administrative leave to go off and lead a bicycle expedition through China.
You had a nice little start to your tenure there.
Oh, it was great. And then I got back 10 days later, I got a request to come over to Australia to talk about what was going on with bicycling in America. So it was like I knew then that I would just keep growing and growing and growing, that the sky was the limit. And things just started to unfold. But when I got to Australia, and I visited 4 different cities, and they really just rolled out the red carpet for me, I came to realize it wasn't about bicycling. It was about walking. And it was about traffic calming. We had neither walking nor bicycling in our country. So I came back. Without asking permission, I changed my title to State Bicycle and Pedestrian Coordinator. So I became the first under that title. And later, when the T legislation passed, the Transportation Efficiency Act, or whatever that was called, they then made it a requirement for all 50 states to have a bicycle and pedestrian coordinator.
Wow.
So that's the origin. That's a long story.
That's an amazing story. That is incredible. It's so interesting, I think, that pedestrian walking piece came after the biking piece. Because to me, you know, you're thinking of like the caveman diagram. It feels like we walk before we do the other stuff. But it's interesting is probably because of that recreation piece, right? People see biking as recreation. So a place like Florida was more apt to enter at that point. And then when you started to go, hey, this is really a transportation equation, it started to change a little bit.
Well, that's it exactly. And maybe the third year I was there, I bumped into somebody in the Department of Energy, and at that time, Exxon had been a really bad player and had cheated the American public out of mega millions of dollars. So they were under court order to fund a bunch of things that would lead to less fuel consumption. And so this fellow I bumped into in the Department of Energy, he and I cooked up an idea that we would hire, it turned out to be 40 people, one in each of their metropolitan areas, and a couple would get 2 full-time positions for 5 years. And so we were kickstarting that. You can't do things at a state level. I mean, you can set the right stage, but it's got to be done locally. And so we were funding all these positions and then training all the people who are hired as staff and coaching them for multiple years. And it was the most amazing thing. And I think I'm debating on which year it was. It's either 1982. I started in 80.
Yeah.
It was either 82 or 84. We passed the first legislation in the nation requiring any time we touched a road, whether we were rebuilding it, resurfacing it, or doing any kind of a tune-up to the road, we had to put in sidewalks, we had to put in bike lanes, and we gave the exemptions. There are times you just don't want to do that. Sure. But that came, I don't know, 20 years before complete streets came into being.
Yeah.
But Florida did it first.
Interesting.
We had a really good set of legislators and governors in those early years.
Okay, I see. I was about to ask. So I was like, how did you manage to pull that off in Florida? No. But do you think, so what was I found this interesting recently that a lot of times it seems that the blue city, red state combo, I mean, we're sitting in an example of this in Tempe, right? Actually works better sometimes for accomplishing stuff because you have less regulation and permitting at the state level, and then you have more energy around that progressive city, but they don't have to go through all the red tape that folks in maybe a California might have to do. Was that the case in Florida, or was it maybe a different political landscape entirely at the time?
Well, I think it became the case. Back when I started in 1980, Florida was a very blue state. There was red, but not strong. Yeah. And we had really solid governors back then, all elected as Democrats. And so they were very positive in wanting to build cities for people, conserving the land and so on. All that changed over time as the population changed, but those were really good years. And I would agree with you that sometimes if the state's not as advanced as it should be, the cities that can be more focused on its people can do the right things, as long as the state doesn't exempt, correct design or positive pro-people types of things like sidewalks, and so on. And the good news is in Florida, as well as I think everywhere in the country now, there are so many people that want walkable cities. I believe the National Real Estate Association says 79% of all Americans buying homes want a walkable neighborhood. And we only have maybe 8% out there.
Yep.
So that's where we are. But the positive news is that more and more people are waking up. They don't want to be slaves to their cars.
Absolutely. And even I found some pushback when I cite the same, statistics you're talking about there. People go, well, sometimes the most expensive houses are in suburbs. I'm like, yes, but even those are right next to the parks, right there. If you're closer to a park or a school, your value is probably going up. That's a form of walkability. Suburban walkability, small town walkability is still a form of this. It doesn't have to just be in the ultra dense areas of the country, which is something that maybe the propaganda against, denser development has done too good of a job at doing, which is convincing that anything that mentions density or the number 15-minute city, anything of that nature is automatically one type of development, when you've worked in a lot of really small towns or suburban communities, I know, in your experience. And I wanted to ask about that, but we kind of lead there here now. Like, is there a beauty in these unsuspecting places for you? Because I know you've done a lot of work in places that maybe you'd have to look up on a map, right? It's not downtown Boston or downtown. It might be, hey, this Farmington, New Mexico, or somewhere like that I know you've done some work in. Has that been an intentional choice to work in places like that, to maybe be in smaller towns, unsuspecting places? Or has it just been kind of the way that those places have asked for and demanded the sorts of services that you were providing at the time?
Right. So around 1996, after being with the Florida Department of Transportation for 16 years, I decided I needed a bigger sandbox, much bigger than just one state. And so I retired and opened my business just by going to a conference and doing a keynote, and people realizing that I represented something they wanted. And then I was invited to Michigan and the metropolitan planning organizations for all the state all get together for an annual conference. So I gave a presentation there, and then that was like a starting gun, right? Yeah. And just in Michigan alone, I think I've worked in over 800 neighborhoods. Just in Detroit, over 100. And so I got to be very well known through my work in Michigan, but I cast my net wide, and I would say that within the first year, already a dozen states had reached out to me, or at least communities in a dozen states. And that kept expanding. I've now worked in all 50. Significant work in a number of states. California might be one of the biggest. Oregon, Washington, even unlikely places like Las Vegas. I launched a major effort in Las Vegas to try to make it a safer place for pedestrians. It's a horribly dangerous place. A lot of things going on that are not very friendly to people who want to walk, right?
Which is ironic, because it is a place where you kind of have to walk to some extent, or you would think so.
Yeah. So at any rate, I've enjoyed probably every size city. I've got, you get a special treat out of working with a very big, complex city like Baltimore or Washington, D.C. And then there are the cities that are so well along with walkability because they couldn't afford to build for cars until way late in the game. And I would say New Orleans is in that category. They finally built the freeway and did damage to their neighborhoods as they did it. Part of that freeway just got to come down someday, and that's already being looked at. But the point is, they kept building great neighborhoods, all while they couldn't afford to tear apart their city with freeways.
Yeah, I was going to ask some examples that you would. So I find a lot of times listeners of this show, other people that are in this conversation, it's always the example of look at Amsterdam, look at Copenhagen. And what we're really trying to do with the guests on the show is be like, there's examples here in the U.S. Again, It might not always be the same five cities that everyone talks about. Oh, they have good transit. That might be true. But I think there's a lot of walkable pockets that are dispersed throughout this country. So maybe putting aside those massive cities that are the usual suspects, again, right. Boston, New York, San Francisco, what are maybe a couple of the places that you've worked on, individually, but also that you have maybe seen as of late take hold of this idea and really make a change in their built environment to be a model, an American model more so?
Right. And there's several categories. One category I'll give is a city that has no downtown. University Place, Washington, just outside of Tacoma, has no downtown. And so I started working there, and we started just with one corridor, just one major street, Bridgeport Way, and revamped it, made it into a real delight, green and easy to cross the street. We were able to corral the speeds a little bit, and really nice sidewalks and good places, but no downtown. But that became the kernel for them to then start to find the funds. They bought a strip center, pretty good sized strip center, and it took them a while. It's not an easy task, but over time they were able to build a downtown in that former strip center that is now one of the hottest places you could buy into.
That's crazy.
Lots of density, mixed use, new city hall, new library, wonderful woods right next to it, preserve park. And that attracted Whole Foods. And then that attracted Trader Joe's. So people from all over Tacoma now come to University Place, a place that was no place because it became walkable.
Yeah.
And so that was a fun project to give life to. I've done a lot of work in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They've got very good staff there. Kara Siderman has been one of the spark plugs there. And she'd be a great interview with someday, by the way.
Sounds awesome.
But over the years, Cambridge focused heavily on transit, walking, and bicycling, putting in every type of feature you could ever dream up. They quadrupled the density, the urban density, the number of housing units per acre. And guess what? The traffic has gone down.
Oh, yeah.
And another example, Vancouver, British Columbia, one of my favorite towns to study. They likewise did everything for transit, for walking, for bicycling. And the good news is they've quadrupled their density on purpose.
Yep.
And now you can do almost everything by foot.
Yeah.
You might use transit to get to some other restaurants or some other anything. But the point is, you don't have to. You can just walk down your street and find an abundance of great places to eat. Almost anything you need, you can find.
Yeah, Vancouver's my favorite city that I've ever been to. Natural setting too. I mean, you can't get better than that. Stanley Park and all that is pristine. So that wonderful examples, and I like how they're all different sizes too, which I think again speaks to what we're talking about. Let's focus on the University Center piece in Washington, because I think that's a really interesting one, because it's starting from scratch, which is we're not from scratch, but you know what I mean. You said there wasn't a downtown stretch there. When you're in that situation and you're kind of helping a group or a city or a community or a combination of all those things get started on a project like that, what are some of the tangible things that you're actually doing with those groups to get that off the ground? Like your work is, I think, the coolest sounding thing in the world. I want to know, what does that actually entail on a tangible standpoint from going into that community and getting started day one?
It's inspiration. And truly, if you can't inspire people, or if they're not ready to be inspired, then, okay, out of the 60 towns you worked in the last 2 months, only 2 took root, right? Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
We can't turn every community around in America all at one time. It just wouldn't work. But University Place, I had been giving a presentation to the American Public Works Association, the state of Washington. And I thought I was doing a good delivery on my keynote. But toward the end, I saw this guy get up and leave. I didn't know why, but I was able later to catch him in the hall and found out that he had gone out to cancel a contract to rebuild a road and then reissue the contract and do everything I was suggesting, which he did. And it's called Grandview Drive. And it's now one of the most studied roads in all of Washington and Oregon. They put in 7 roundabouts, bike lanes, inset parking. And here's the cool thing is a few years later, after this became the primo road and a choice neighborhood to live in, they even, out of road monies, dedicated areas for parks. And so anyway, they called in the county executive on a particular day, and all got out of the car, and they said to the county executives, "We'd like for you to take down this barbed wire. It just looks ugly, and it's our principal road now." And the county executive very smartly said, "Well, what's on the other side?" and they said, "Nothing. It's just a big gravel quarry." So he said, "Well, let's look at it." They stepped over, and with vision, he realized it was facing into the Pacific, right, into the great Puget Sound. And he said, "I'm going to build the best golf course anyone's ever dreamed up." So he hires the world's expert at building golf clubs. They build it, and even before it's completed, the U.S. Open signs a contract worth millions of dollars to have the U.S. Open there. That's the kind of magic. So I like to say I'm responsible for one of the greatest golf courses,
you're a golf
even though
course
I don't
planner,
play golf.
you know?
Right?
Hey, take credit for it. No, and I think it's that whole thing which you mentioned earlier, the leading with walkability, right? This is not a sidecar piece of value to a place. This is the driving factor for economic, and we haven't even gotten into the health side, which I know you're very involved in now, but
Yeah. So I didn't fully answer your question on what are the ingredients, and how do you know if you're making the right impact? And again, I was totally surprised when I found out that this public works director had canceled a contract because of my presentation. Well, anyway, he and I became best friends. Not Ben Watts. He was Secretary of Transportation. Ben, Greek. Ben. I'll remember.
you've got a lot of names
I'll
to remember.
it.
So,
But anyway, Ben took the idea and carried it forward. And one thing I said before I left town, I said that change has to go through 3 stages. And this is quoted by many brilliant minds, Schopenhauer included. I take mine from Schopenhauer. The first level of change is people will laugh at you and ridicule you. And then the second change is people will try to stop you, and they'll work hard to try to stop you because they realize you're not going to go away. Sure. And the third one is acceptance. And every change has to go through those 3 stages. All the great philosophers and thinkers throughout time have come up with that same conclusion. But anyway, I shared that with Ben. Anyway, about 2 years later, I get a call in the middle of the night, and it's Ben. And Ben says, "Dan, we're now at the ridicule side, and I'm getting it from the press. I'm getting it from every direction, and they won't let me alone." And I just started laughing. I said, "Ben, you know what the next step is.
Yeah.
You're on your way." And he laughed. And then he said, "You're right, Dan." It was amazing. But they were giving him a very hard time because he's trying to bring change.
Sure. So have you always kind of kept that as a piece, in the forefront of your mind? Because it is interesting. The optimism piece, I mean, most people that I meet that have worked in and around government and public affairs for long enough reach a point where they're like, I gotta go, I gotta get far away from this. And it's fascinating to me that you have maintained this level of optimism. So I was gonna ask how you've done that, but it sounds like that sort of thing, keeping that in the forefront of your mind of this is actually natural, right? This adverse reaction to what I'm proposing means that I've started the process of change, if that's fair.
That is very fair. In fact, I'm now 80. And I would say I've been doing this since I was 25, and my energy just keeps building.
Wow!
Because I see the end result, and I think that is something that every one of your podcast listeners needs to realize, that we're in this for the long haul, but we all have the opportunity to leave a legacy, and that legacy will go way beyond our own lives, way beyond. And you just think of any of the great changes in all of society. Martin Luther King, he knew that his work wouldn't ever be finished during his lifetime. Cut short, of course, in his life. But the point is, he knew. And I think anyone who's a great leader, either spiritually or just has a great idea in mind that's positive, it's going to really bring the right change, they're in for the greatest ride and the greatest reward anyone could ever have. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, I mean, sage to remember, I think, as someone who's up and coming in this general space. It's like some days you feel kind of that pull, but I think returning to that fact, I can see that it is, worked wonders for you. So that's amazing to hear.
Oh yeah. And it doesn't matter what it is you're working on at the moment. Like right now, one of the big things I'm doing, I lead mobile study tours for folks, groups of 30 or more who are inspired, who want to see and touch the real things. The towns and the neighborhoods have made it, right? So right now I'm putting together a mobile study, we call it a workshop, for 30 of the very top legislators in Hawaii. We're taking them over to Norway, Denmark, and Sweden to understand how safety works. I mean, those are countries that they've cut their numbers of traffic fatals to minor numbers, and they continue to build great communities as a result. But we want to take the great leaders in the state of Hawaii there. Well, putting this tour together is a lot harder than you would think. I mean, you're dealing with government issues and whether it's the right atmosphere to do this, right? I mean, they just had the horrible fire in Maui. Yeah. And so they're cutting back state budgets. Is this the right time to be doing this? Yes, it's the right time. Yeah. But you just got to go through every single step. Don't let anything stop you. There's no such thing as being stopped. You could be slowed.
Sure.
You could, like I once had a staff member that just wanted to save Lee County, Florida, a very conservative area. And after weeks and weeks of trying to convince some staff down there to change some of their policies, I said to her, Pat, we've got 66 other counties you can be working in. When Lee County's ready, we'll hear. But we have to know where there's an open channel for doing great things and not just beat our heads against the bushes or whatever you beat your head against. And I think she understood, and we kept doing great things in Florida as long as we had the resources. We were just cranking out one product after another.
And I remember you saying it at some point. I've heard you say in the past something along the lines of, at one point in Florida, when you were looking at some of the roads, you intentionally made them wider in anticipation that down the road you would then have an easier time putting bike lanes in. This blew my mind when I heard this, because it is literally counter to what you actually are trying to do, which is narrow the lanes, lower speeds. But you had the foresight, to use a soccer reference here, I'm a former player and coach and stuff, but the pass before the pass, right? Everybody always talks about the assist, but the pass that sets up the assist is sometimes more important and it's harder to see. You took what I guess would be considered a risk, right? And making the lane wider, going, hey, this might actually have an adverse effect in the short term. But once all these people come around to the bike lane idea, we don't have to go tear road up and widen it. We just got to put the lane in. That is amazing. First of all, how the heck did that come about? How did you have that foresight to see that? I'm really fascinated by that choice.
Well, I'm not sure I was the only one at the time who had that idea. Way back in those ages, 1980s, the dark ages, you couldn't build bike lanes. I mean, it was just, that was off the charts. You going to do something for bicyclists, right? Or people walking. And those were the years where anyone walking probably was just a nobody, right? And so you didn't want to support people walking back then. So the idea came up that we couldn't build in bike lanes, but we could build wide outer lanes, 14 foot. And then in my mind, it's just a number of years until we're going to repaint this whole road and have really fully high quality bike lanes or buffered bike lanes in. So you just had to have that insight. Okay, we can't do this now because of where people are, but that doesn't mean we can't do really good things. So we made it a policy every time we built a road, the outer lanes would be wide. And that was actually an easy sell within the Department of Transportation. More paving, more jobs, more buddies that used to work for us, make more money, you know. So it all was logical.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have any resistance. And it worked.
Yeah.
But the funny one, I've never shared this on a podcast before. It was 1991 when the T legislation, the Transport Enhancement Act, was passed. And they now were requiring states to devote money to walking and bicycling for the first time. And back then, there were no firms that would ever do a bicycle plan. I mean, there's no money. Right. But now there was money. But the cool thing is the high-level people in the Florida DOT didn't read the legislative language that closely. I had. And I realized that all this money that was to go into walkability and bicycling, that it was not to be hidden somewhere else. And so what they wanted to do is just take credit anytime they built a sidewalk or a bicycle facility, when the measure that really called for building roads differently. So they thought that all that money that was being stolen from them in their thinking, you know, being road pavers, that they would get around that by just signing off that they would do what I was asking for. And it turns out that they were cheating themselves because they were still required to upgrade the roads. And so they couldn't take credit for it. So Florida ended up with a double bonus, I'd like to say, where more money went into walkability and bicycling at the time than any other state. It was just amazing how much was being focused around model projects, every street rebuild, and so on. So it was pretty cool.
That's so interesting. So I have to ask then, with your current day hat on, what is the modern day equivalent of that looking 2 steps ahead? Because I want to steal this from you. This next looking forward, like if you had to take the same thing you did where you're looking at, hey, if we widen this lane right now, it's going to work because people will get on board with it. They're not seeing that when the bike project comes in and when public interest and excitement gets around that, it'll be easier to implement. Is there a modern equivalent to that right now where you're saying people aren't there yet, but if we set this up to meet their needs now and say, hey, here's a wider lane as an example, it'll be easier in 2030, 2035 to convert on the thing that we're actually trying to do?
Yeah, I think there are just many ways that if we look at what we're trying to get to, right, maybe 20 years from now, and think long term always, that if we, for example, want to build good sidewalks, but for whatever reason, lack of right of way or whatever, we have to build it to the edge of the street. That sidewalk is miserable to walk on.
Absolutely.
It's right where the driveways interrupt every driveway and so on. It's just not the right way to make walking comfortable. But if you put things in combination, like a bike lane, or a buffered bike lane, or a protected bike system, then all of a sudden the sidewalk becomes wonderful because it's so far from moving traffic, right? I've always said that the real purpose of bike lanes has nothing to do with bicyclists. It's preserving the edge of the road, creating the buffers, creating the actual turn radius, everything that benefits a better road, a safer road, occurs if you add the bike lanes. Better sight lines, better everything.
Yeah, the daylighting effect, right?
Yeah.
You're creating space.
And it's also a tool to finally be able to narrow the travel lanes. 12-foot travel lanes were built originally, that number, for tanks.
Yeah.
You know, we were worried about World War II and could we get our tanks down the road. There was no justification ever for a local street to be 12 foot wide. It just was one of these crazy things that somebody dreamed up, will make more money or whatever it was, that was just so wrong.
Yeah.
So the first day I was on my job in Florida in 1980, I went over to the Federal Highway Administration offices and found a friendly face. And I said, is there any reason why we can't insist that no lanes in an urban area be wider than 11 feet? And he happened to agree with me. And so we just made it universal that 11 foot should be the standard, not 12. I knew we couldn't go down to 10 at that time. Today, I'm heavily promoting 10 foot wide lanes. Yeah. That gives you, depending on the size of the street, all the width you need to put in a bike lane or a buffered bike lane or whatever else you need, right?
Sure.
So, yeah, we've always focused on building roads that are safer for everyone. And I will say, after all the work we did in Florida, Florida has been and it will always be the most dangerous state to be a pedestrian or a bicyclist. The speeds are exotically high. The car dependency is so high that every time a new neighbor gets built, it's just worsening the problem. We have a lot of older drivers in Florida. We have a lot of older pedestrians. When older people get hit as a pedestrian, they rarely survive.
Sure.
It's just a sad reality. So Florida will always be out front in that sense. No matter how much money or how much effort one can make, what policies we have, we can't overcome the negative factors in that state with the growth it's had. When I started, we had 6 million. I think now Florida is probably 22, 23 million people.
Yeah.
And they just keep coming, and they will. It's got a lot of positive attributes. Certainly climate, the beaches, everything like that.
Yeah. So when we talk about the built environment norms, like you just mentioned, right, places like Florida, but that might be an extreme in some ways, but it is the same most places, I think, in the U.S., right? That is what that's our traditional development pattern is sprawl, suburbia, cul-de-sacs, not the cul-de-sac we're in now, but the, traditional use of the word. Your professional career aligned and your life so far is aligned with this kind of rise, and now I think is referenced as kind of a conspiracy in the auto lobby, right? We always hear about, the auto lobby did this. It's impossible to do this. I mean, I'm guilty. I reference it in that way all the time. You saw firsthand a lot of their work. I would imagine you were a target of a lot of their kind of, pushback or strategy and getting around the sorts of things you were spearheading throughout the country. What did the auto lobby kind of look like in a real practical sense throughout your professional work? Like, how did they rear their head in coming back and maybe trying to counter some of the progress that you were trying to steward in?
Yeah. Well, there is a lot of anti-car movement, which I think is wrong. We can't be anti-car. I mean, it's part of who we are. Sure. I've tried to stay away from that. Yeah. But then there are times when crazy people will come up with, you can't fund a sidewalk or you can't fund something for people who don't pay taxes. Wait a minute. Most of the people who ride bikes pay more in taxes. Sure. It's a reality. They tend to own homes. They tend to, their contribution is much higher than even the average driver who doesn't. So it's a matter of having the facts straight and being able to express that. One of the funniest things that happened in my career, I was in some small town in California. I think I've forgotten the name of it, but I was slated to come on to address the city council. But before I was to come on, this guy came up right past me and says, "You're not going to like what I have to say." So he went up and gave his little 3-minute whatever. He was with the Tea Party. It wasn't known that well back then, but he was just anti-government. And he really made it easier for me to go in and then set the stage for a good action that the city could take, right? So sometimes you look for for the really negative person who just doesn't get it. They're too stupid.
Sure.
And I've had those gifts hand delivered to me multiple times, and I just love it.
You're just licking your
you
chops.
Know how you're going to be able to take this and use it as part of the platform and say, look, folks, it's not that way.
Right.
And they know.
Right.
There are city councilors that just go in for their own self-interest, and they aren't there to build a city. But you quickly identify them. There are some towns that we're working in right now, the Blue Zones organization, that they're very conservative.
Yeah.
And it's sad because every town deserves more love, more place, more for every person to be treated equally. And so I just think in the last 5 years, ever since before the pandemic even, that we are now focusing on equity, diversity. We're not using the word kindness or anything like that, but I'm now working in all kinds of neighborhoods that we weren't allowed to go in and touch earlier, because people are becoming much more sensitized that we've got to be supporting all people, not just some.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love how you kind of use that example there. I've thought a lot recently about how we can deliver these messages to more conservative groups of folks and why they actually have rationale to support these things too. It might be different at the entry point from ours, right? But we can all end up enjoying it in the end. And it doesn't really matter who was right and wrong if we had different reasons for getting there. I mean, you may have seen recently a clip from the National Governors Association winter meetings of Doug Burgum, the Republican governor of North Dakota, talking about, the cost and the massive, economic strain and fiscal irresponsibility, really, of building sprawl in suburbia. And that's the 47th most populous state in the United States. And he's talking about how we need to build more walkable neighborhoods and communities. And you hear someone like that and you go, oh yeah, because if you're less government, if you're for that side of things and for fiscal responsibility, and you don't want, reckless spending from your government at the state or city level, well, you shouldn't be building sprawl. That's the worst idea. Everything is on a per mile cost. You're building road, you're building sewer, you're building utilities, all of that. And it has to be constantly repaired. So I loved hearing him say that. I mean, this was a potential Trump VP pick that's talking about this. And we might have totally different backgrounds on it, but it's awesome that he is saying that, because it just shows it doesn't matter how you got there. We both actually benefit from exactly the stuff you're working on.
Well, absolutely. And it's not a blue or a red issue. It truly is bipartisan. You have to look long and hard to find anything but more bipartisan than walkability. Mm-hmm. It's just like, why would you build something that you can't maintain, something that doesn't make money? Right. One of the leaders I like to follow is Joe Minakazi, Urban 3. And Joe does this beautiful analysis where he shows yield per acre. So if you look at a block or a full acre in the downtown, and you can get the right mix, the right density on that block, it's worth 800% more than the same acre with Walmart and or not doing anything in the downtown, right? And it's really cool. One of the real comeback cities, and it's a bigger city, is Charlotte. Yeah. And they had a great mayor who was a Republican, and he got it. And he basically made the statement, something to the effect that any governor or mayor who believes that sprawl is the answer just doesn't get it. Yeah. We need urban density. We need light rail. We need all the things. And I was very fortunate to later go in and work on their light rail project to work on the stations, the locations, and what would grow up around them. So
that's so cool.
Yeah,
that's amazing. I love that. So on the Blue Zones piece, I want to hit that because I think that's interesting. You have spent so much time in the planning world on transportation, on active transportation. Now you're really getting to look at it from this health perspective, right? The whole thing about blue zones is longevity and quality of life and all these things. I think we were talking earlier, I think we all, our generation got shown some sort of documentary in school that referenced blue zones. And it was always, here's this lower income community in this other country that has a higher happiness score. And I think that's how we all got introduced to it. But you've really taken it to this level of talking about walkability and how that often seems to parallel and map these really happy and healthy long-term places. I'm curious, how have you, maybe it was when you went into it, so maybe that's a good place to start, but when did you realize that walkability and this whole blue zone thing went hand in hand, and that all these places have an extremely high kind of appetite and built piece to the walkability equation already?
Well, almost everything in my life I've walked into backwards. I don't have any degrees that relate to what I do, but I've always had great mentors. So as I've climbed the series of steps, people would recognize what I was doing and said, I'm an architect. I need to mentor Dan. He's on the right track, but I want to make sure we give him more power and authority and leadership. And that's absolutely true in every profession in the built environment. Landscape architecture, engineering, planning, economics. I've always had the best mentors. And I think that's a good lesson for all of your listeners is the more your heart is in something and you become known for what you're trying to do, other people are going to come and mentor you, right? And at a certain age, I recognized this when I turned 65, you become the mentor for others because you're only going to last so many more years, right? Well, I'm 80 now, and I think if I can keep this up for another 10 years, right, I'm going to focus mostly on mentoring others. That's my job. And but I think the point is that when I got into blue zones, again, it was through a back door, and it's a funny back door. When I led my bicycle expedition from Alaska to Argentina, the big quest was to get it written up in National Geographic and other big magazines, which we did. And a person who read that article, his name was Dan Buettner, and he was up in Wisconsin, I believe it was, Brainerd, when I was doing a presentation on our expedition. And I recognized Dan having just done that himself. So I called him up on stage and celebrated Dan. And he never forgot that. Any rate, 30 years, 40 years go by. And I'm sitting in my office one day and I get this call from someone I didn't know the name of, Dan Buettner. And Dan said that he's been calling around all the top medical universities in the country, and they all say to build walkability, we don't have any professors or anybody who does that. It's all theory, but there's this one guy out there doing it, and his name is Dan Burden. And so this day that Dan calls me, he says, is there any chance that you're the same Dan Burden that rode a bike from Alaska to Argentina? I said, yeah, Dan. And he said, I have always thought of you and thanked you for what you did for me. I mean, Dan went on and he did the whole expedition in less than a year, set a Guinness World Record. Then he bicycled all of Africa, setting another Guinness World Record. And then around the world, set a third long-distance bicycle touring record. So Dan shared with me his idea. He had done all the research around the world, the 5 places where people live longest, happiest, healthiest lives. And he said, I want to reverse engineer and do that in an American city. And I said, that's a great idea. He said, would you join me in doing that? And I said, sure. So he picked the town. It was Albert Lea, Minnesota. And we went up together and listened to what the town was wanting to do. And we always listen to the town because we're outsiders no matter what, right? And so they wanted to widen their main street through downtown. And so I asked the question, do you have money for that? And they said, yeah. I said, good. Then we're going to tighten it down. We're going to make it for people, more place and everything. And they did it. And they went from like 60% occupancy clear up to 100% with a waiting list to get into having a business in the downtown.
Wow.
So, yeah, sometimes it's just luck. It really is. But you put yourself in the position for that luck comes back and reimburses you for being patient.
Certainly. So you talked about that and the mentorship piece. I'm curious if you're talking to some younger up and coming, whether the multiple professions you just listed earlier, planners and planning adjacent professions, we'll call them, maybe not specific places in the U.S., but the sorts of environments that maybe those folks should look out for when they're going to really make some change and get some momentum started in an area. Is there a certain type of situation or group or town or city that is a good place to look for? So, people might be graduating school and looking for where they want to go work in a city planning office or maybe a private firm. Is there a sort of situation that you think is a great place to start if you really want to dive headfirst and get involved in these sorts of things?
Well, for me, first and foremost, for the last almost 28 years now that I've been on my own doing this with the larger sandbox, I have accepted almost every job that came along. And because I don't want to give up on any community, but I would say at least 1 out of 10, they're just not ready. Maybe the next 4 or 5 or 6 out of 10, they're ready, but you have to find the right leader.
I see.
And but then the final, maybe the top 10%, they're ready. They've got the right leadership, and they're going to go places. All you have to do is fire the starting gun, right? You're validating. You're giving them permission because they already know where they should go, and they just need somebody who wears this title as a specialist in walkability to come in and say, "You're ready. Go do it."
Certainly.
And it's going to be a hard road, but it's going to be a fun one in the end. Just like University Place. It took them 30 years to build that town center. Yeah. It was not overnight. Not quick. They went through 2 recessions. They went through, I think it was 3 developers until they finally found the right magic to really have it work.
I see.
But it was destined to happen because they had a staff that would not give up. They even ran through their entire city council's term limits and got a brand new city council in that weren't ready to be that bold, but the staff had that staying power, and one by one they brought all of the city council members on board and delivered a home run.
So one takeaway I have from just this conversation and, knowing what I know about you and learning what I'm learning about you now is more than anything, more than a planner, it seems like you're a very effective communicator and storyteller of these sorts of ideas, whether it be in council meetings or leading, walking audits or whatever it may be. When I was taking some classes for city planning program a couple years ago, I think I've told this story a few times, but I think 7 out of the 8 of the professors that I interacted with in that semester said something in the first week of classes to the tune of city planning has an existential communications problem is how I've kind of framed it, where the most important thing in this industry right now is taking these technical ideas that the technocrats in the office are working on, and they're doing a good job in some ways, and distilling it into bite-sized, understandable information that the average person who's never thought about the word walkability, let alone urbanism, can digest. To me, you've done that better than anyone in the United States. And that is beyond motivating to me as like someone who's really dove into that communication world and seen that as my potential place here. So to see you kind of really living that out, every answer you've given has really given me that feel of like, no, at the end of the day, you were just really good at explaining really complex things in simple terms that got people on board in one way or another in multiple orders. And that's really, really neat. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, one of the real turning points in my life, my career, I had been out still in love with bicycling and wanting to get more communities to do the right thing. And I heard about this course offered. It was a 3-day course on public engagement. And Hans and Anna Marie Bleicher. I hope that at least their offspring are still doing these courses. And I remember them telling the stories of towns where it backfired because they didn't take the right steps. And I don't want to mention the name of the town, but it was in Colorado on the Front Range. And they had spent $500,000. And back then, that was a lot of money for planning to lay out their new downtown. Because they saw the change. They saw that they need to switch from a suburban to a more urban place, which was the right direction to go. And one person came up in a meeting and put down the idea of what they were about to do, and they just wrote that person off. He had been a former chief of police, and he had a grudge against the city. So they just wrote off this guy. But what he said was correct, and they didn't follow that. And the sad thing is when the plan was completed, it backfired because they hadn't taken the right steps. And I believe it was the city manager who committed suicide. And the rest of the staff left town and has never been heard of since. So I realized right then and there, it wasn't the technical answers that I needed. It was how do you get a vision to take root and get enough people to work together to carry out and to understand that it's not going to happen overnight, right? So I went back to college, got my master's training in interpersonal communication, which is as close as you can get to public engagement. I mean, it's everything in communications. So that was my career choice, and that served me well.
Yeah.
And I think any planner, engineer, architect, landscape architect that doesn't at least devote half their time to learning how to communicate effectively, they're not going to go anywhere.
Sure.
You know, and you read about the great architects, people like Jan Gehl, you know, the space between buildings. And he came to realize after, I believe the story is correct, that his wife said to him, Jan, the designs that you've been taught are not going to work. It's because they don't relate to people. And so he really came to realize it's the space between buildings. It's a social use of space. And I think every great author I've been able to absorb has had that kind of inspirational aha moment in their growth in their career. Whether, again, no matter how great the person, they had to go through this gestalt, this jump, this leap forward into the future and think of things differently than all their associates or peers or compatriots had.
I love it so much. So the last question that we ask everyone on the show, it's called Good Traffic. The point of the show largely is we're trying to look at this thing that everyone has kind of written off as ugly, inconvenient part of the day, how you get from point A to point B, and saying, no, this could actually be one of the most dynamic and beautiful parts of your day that you look forward to. I think you've lived that out on many different levels, but I'm curious, in all the various places that you've lived and worked throughout your life, what has been your favorite commute that you've ever had?
Favorite commute? Oh my gosh. Well, my commute anymore is going down from my upstairs to my office downstairs. So that's become
like that
my
one?
favorite. It may not be the healthiest. I think back when I was going to college and running the bike centennial at the time, now called adventure cycling. I would bike every day to the office. And it was just such a quiet, relaxing time. And then likewise going back and doing that in Tallahassee, Florida as well. My commute was a bit longer and a little more stressful, but I would try to outrun the storms, sometimes not make it, and be just totally drenched when I got home. And so I'd say anytime I bike commuted, it was my favorite, just because it allows you time to free your mind, get the endorphins running, and I read it. No, I didn't read it. I heard it on National Public Radio one time that a person who actively gets to work, that is, walks or rides a bike, will be much more productive for like, I don't know, it's almost like 2 hours, right? And then the person sitting in a car, it's a negative. It actually blocks your brain and keeps you from having the great thoughts. So my whole career has been around getting as much done as I can before, say, 8 in the morning. My body's built that way.
Sure.
And so I used to go to the Florida DOT. I'd walk there. It was too short to bike. And I would typically get there at 4 in the morning. And by 8 o'clock, I had done more work than anyone was going to in their whole 8-hour day.
It's a quiet office, huh? At that time,
Yeah.
not too many coworkers around to talk to you.
Yeah, yeah. So I love commuting anytime by foot or by bike.
I love it. That answer makes sense to me. I was going to ask you, I just thought of one thing. When you were growing up on the west side of Columbus, was there a Schwinn store that was near you?
There, in time, became one.
Okay.
Back when I was a kid, all the bike shops were for kids.
Yeah.
And Schwinn did sell some bikes, but even bike shops were, it was almost always a lawnmower store.
Yeah.
And I think at one point I might have had access to a Schwinn or touched a Schwinn because that was the hot thing, right? Yeah, I don't think we had a Schwinn store. They came later.
Yeah, I asked because my dad worked at one in his teenage years on the west side. I didn't know when it opened, so I was wondering if it was open when you were riding around there. But it must have come a little after that because I know he was around 16, 17. He was working in that Schwinn store on the west side. So just curious. But
Wilbur Scott, one of the very first bicycle salespeople in Columbus, and he must have had 500 old bikes sitting in his basement. But that's where I bought my first really good bike. It was a Grand Prix, and later bought one way up from that. It was a marvelous Mobile Bacon, just a beautiful bike. Back then, the best bike you could get, and they were really well designed and constructed. Fully outfitted, even with racks and everything, was $110.
I wish. I wish we were at that price right now. That would be quite nice.
Yeah.
I'm looking at some gravel bikes right now, and they're a little more than bit more than that. So saving up. We'll see. Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time. This has been an awesome conversation. Super glad we got through this. I'm super glad you're enjoying your stay here in Tempe and hanging out. And thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Pleasure.